Hello, today I'm going to be discussing underglaze and glaze. Before firing, they look very similar. After firing, it's a different story. Here's a piece with underglaze, and here's a piece using similar colors with a glaze application over it. As you can see, there is quite a bit of a difference. So, when to use underglaze or glaze? There are many ceramic products out there that can be used to finish a piece. To simplify for this presentation, I will be covering the two most commonly used, underglaze and glaze. These you find in most ceramic studios. I will not be going over the chemical composition of these at this time, but the basics involved in selection of these for your work. Underglaze is basically a clay slip with pigment. A little more complex though, as it can be applied to greenware or bisque. Slip is applied to greenware only. Underglaze has no gloss or sheen to it. Here's an example. And a few more examples. A glaze application will be required after an initial firing to achieve a glossy surface. A satin or matte option may also be selected as a finish. Here's an example of a matte surface. Underglaze can be applied on greenware or bisqueware. So example of greenware, this piece again, it hasn't been fired. Or a bisqueware, something that has been fired. Let's go over some ceramic terms before we continue. Greenware is the term used for unfired ceramic work. Bisqueware is ceramic work which has gone through a preliminary or bisque firing. Wetware is wet clay straight out of the bag, or in slip casting it's a piece straight out of the mold. Leather hard clay is partially dried clay, dried sufficiently so as it is stiff, moisture is visible, it can still be easily manipulated, and is damp enough to be joined to other pieces. Stiff leather hard is just beyond the leather hard state. Moisture is still visible, but it's dry to the point where if manipulated, it most likely would break or crack. Bone dry. And these were actually examples of bone dry pieces. It's past the leather hard stages, no moisture is visible. This is the most fragile stage of greenware. All of these stages, wet, leather hard, stiff leather hard, and bone dry, all fall under the category of greenware as they have not been fired. Once fired in a preliminary firing called a bisque fire, the ware are then referred to as bisqueware. Why do we need to know this? There's actually several reasons, but for this discussion, because most underglazes can be applied to greenware or bisqueware. When we say underglaze can be applied to greenware, this includes leather hard, stiff leather hard, bone dry clay. Clay is actually more fragile in its greenware stage, so many people usually opt to apply their underglazes to bisqueware. I personally prefer to apply it to greenware. It is important to know that both underglaze and glaze usually need 3 applications, 3 coats of underglaze and 3 coats of glaze. Always be sure to read manufacturer's recommendations. There are some clear glazes that only require 2 coats. Applying more can create a foggy effect on the surface of one's piece. Important, glaze should only ever be applied to bisqueware. Details regarding why will be covered in another video. Again, if all of this terminology seems unclear, no worries. Soon it will be more clear as we discuss this further. Let's get to why we would choose underglaze over glaze. Of course, there are always exceptions, but here are some of the most common reasons underglazes would be chosen. Underglaze would be chosen for detail and work. I'll give some examples. Some fine lines, detail and work, small areas, colors next to areas, colors on top of areas. For example, stripes, or an example of colors on top of colors would be some polka dots. Underglazes do not shift or move. They're a great selection for designs where color needs to stay in specific areas. Here is a sample of some underglazes, and as you can see, the colors do not shift, they stay right in place. And then next to them is where a clear gloss or clear glaze has been applied to them, giving them a glossy surface. So your underglazes are going to be stable, they're not going to shift, and that would be a good selection if you're having colors next to colors. Here's another example where you have fine lines, you don't want them shifting, so underglaze would be chosen. And the underglaze again is where it's this chalky kind of matte surface, and then you see how bright it gets once the clear coat has been placed on it. So let's discuss glazes. There are so many types of glazes and specialty glazes. Here again we'll only cover the two most common, opaque and translucent glazes. Opaque meaning the clay underneath is not visible, impenetrable by light. So here's an example of some opaque glazes. Right here. The opaque would be these colors right here. So opaque again meaning the clay underneath is not visible. And semi-transparent or translucent glazes, the clay underneath is visible. So it would be these right here. A little glare there. But as you can see, kind of translucent. The clay underneath is visible. So kind of think of stained glass, like a layer of stained glass. So let's discuss surfaces. Something to know about clear glazes, there are clear glazes with different surfaces. You might have a glossy surface, or a satin surface, or a matte surface. Or even a combination of two or more. So let's describe them a little more in detail. A matte surface option can be described as kind of a dull surface lacking luster or a reflective quality. A satin has a slight sheen to it, and then there's the shiny or glossy surface, which has a very reflective quality to it. In the end, whichever you choose, you should end up with a very clear and colorful design. So back to firing for a minute. When using glaze over an underglaze, some choose to avoid a third firing. So you have a preliminary firing and then your glaze firing, but if you're putting an underglaze on a bisque piece, then we're talking about possibly having a third firing. I'll go into that a little more detail another time, but basically some people like to avoid having a third additional firing. This is because applying glaze over freshly applied underglaze, even though it's dry, can sometimes cause streaking or smearing. This has to do with the application. There are always ways to avoid smears and smudges, and this will be covered in a different video on application. But basically, if you put your underglaze on greenware and then you fire it up to bisque, it will come back and you'll put your glaze on it and then fire it for its final glaze firing. If you choose to put your underglaze on bisqueware and you want to avoid firing it again and then having it returned and then putting a clear coat and then firing it one more time, that's kind of what we're discussing here. It's avoiding that third firing. So that is where application would be key if you plan to glaze it after underglazing on bisque and then just go for one final firing. If that's confusing, not to worry, it will be covered in another video, but that's another reason where choices between underglazes and glazes, come to mind. So when to choose a glaze over an underglaze? Perhaps you just have one color that you want to use to cover the surface of your piece. So something like this. Then you would just go ahead and choose a glaze. And you could choose, or something like this. So you could just choose a colored glaze to cover the surface. One reason is so that you want to avoid putting 3 coats of an underglaze and then another 3 coats of clear. So choosing a glaze in the color that you want to use for that one area might be an option. Suppose I have texture on my piece and I want it to be visible, then a translucent glaze would be an ideal choice to showcase the design. The glaze will break over the high points and pull into the recessed areas. So here's an example of that. You have an incised piece and the glaze is pulling into the recessed areas, breaking over the high points. And so you almost have, you have several things going on. It almost looks like 3 different colors here. So a translucent glaze will also show any texture you might have put under your piece. Incising, here's another example. And so again, any of those techniques that we might have used, incising, impressed, textures, impressed texture, slip trailing, etc. There are specialty glazes that are not shiny, more matte, that will showcase or enhance the appearance of surface texture, but we'll save the discussion of specialty glazes for another time. So back to the fundamental glazes, opaque and semi-translucent glazes. Remember that glazes can shift or run, and it's important to know that the shinier glazes, the more likely it is to run. Glazes would not be a good choice if one is planning colors next to colors, as they will shift slightly. And so you can kind of see here how those were actually straight lines and they started to shift onto one another. Glazes are not a likely choice if you're looking for detail. In some cases, let's say you design something, let's say foliage with several greens next to each other, and you don't mind that they shift and maybe overlapped a bit, then you could maybe go with glazes. So there's some other glazes. So you see that they kind of shift. So if you don't mind that they're shifting, like you have something where it's not really necessary that they be very distinct lines, then you could go with the glaze. Depending on the look you're going for in your piece, glazes should not be applied over glazes. For example, if I'm creating a polka dot design, there are several reasons for that. If I paint the surface area 3 coats, then put 3 coats of another color on top, let's say maybe even some larger polka dots, there are several things that can happen. The colors are going to integrate and blend into each other, and the polka dots may end up a surprise color, maybe an undesirable color. Something else that can happen is that the glaze can become so thick due to so many coats that on a vertical surface it could run, and on a horizontal surface like a plate, it might repel on itself, leaving a bald spot and exposing the clay underneath. So those are reasons that you would again choose to go with a underglaze rather than a glaze. In going over those basic considerations in underglazing and glazing, it's also important to know that application is key. What type of brush are you using? How have you prepared the surface? How many coats of the product are required? What is the time between coats? These are just some of the many questions that should be considered. These questions and techniques will be covered in an application video. So let's review. When do I choose underglazes? If I want colors next to colors, colors on top of colors, that might be a good reason. If I have detail, a lot of little tiny detail in my pieces, polka dots, stripes, where I really need the color to be stable. Where I might want to have glazes if I'm just having one solid color, or I don't mind that the colors shift. So those are really the fundamental reasons, the fundamentals of glazing. Glazes over underglazes. Another reason I might want a glaze would be if I have a surface texture and I really want that surface texture to show up. So, and one last thing is that when selecting your colors, know that they are going to change dramatically once you put that colored, that glaze on top of your pieces. So hopefully this information has provided a brief summary of considerations when deciding whether to use underglaze or glaze for your surface treatment.